Murray has quite a broad and deep experience. He's an economist. He's worked in a range of areas, notably in agriculture, but he's also worked with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. He's been an executive director at the World Bank and so on. Very broad experience, perfect background actually for his current role. And the New Zealand Productivity Commission has recently issued a report which gets into the territory that Cass Sunstein's been talking about actually, the question of regulatory regimes and institutions and how to make them work better. So over to Murray Sherwin. Thank you.
Tēnā good morning, and thank you, Gary. What Gary did say is that he was heavily influential in the creation of the New Zealand Productivity Commission a little over 3 years ago. Was also heavily influential in the selection of the inaugural chair, in which role he demonstrated his usual infinite wisdom and solidity. Thank you, Gary. I'm going to be talking about this review that we've just completed, a piece on New Zealand's regulatory institutions and practice. It's a big report, and I'm going to be skipping quite lightly across a lot of it. But just let me set a little context first. In most respects, New Zealand rates pretty well on the usual measures of national governance. The OECD indices of the quality of product market regulation would typically place New Zealand well ahead of its comparator nations. Measures of economic and political freedom, ease of doing business, freedom from corruption, all of those routinely put New Zealand near the top of the class. And given a unicameral or single house parliamentary system and the lack of a formal constitution, or at least any single document that would constitute or could be called that, it's just as well that our institutional structures, our governance practices and the less formal cultural mores and conventions appear to keep us on a reasonably straight and narrow path. But we were asked to look at whether our regulatory system was really as good as it should be. And we published this last week, and our conclusion is that however comforting all of those international comparisons might appear, the day-to-day realities are a little less reassuring. Just get some slides going here. There we go. So what were we asked to do? Well, specifically, we were asked to provide guidance and suggestions on how new regulations and regulatory institutions should be designed. It's essentially a guidebook for a public servant who's asked to do this task for the first time, and maybe the only time in their career. We were asked to advise on how to improve the way our regulatory system works, and also to look at the monitoring of the performance of regulators, where we had a few issues brewing. There's some context to all of this, and you heard a bit from Bill English yesterday. Firstly, we regulate a lot, and it's costly. It's costly directly in terms of compliance costs on third parties and in terms of dynamic efficiency effects. The New Zealand Parliament sits for only around 90 days each year, but it's a busy little parliament, manages to pass about 4 times more public acts than the UK Parliament does each year. And we occasionally have regulatory failures, and sometimes those regulatory failures have very big, in fact, catastrophic consequences. We face increasing complexity, which is a particular issue for Bill English. And that complexity comes from a number of different directions. Growing diversity of population, and that diversity is reflected in diverse expectations. It's reflected in diverse risk appreciation, risk tolerances that regulators need to cope with. We've also got rapid change, particularly driven by technological issues, and the regulatory system really struggles to catch up and keep pace with the change of technology and other changes coming through, market changes in particular. When we look across our statutes, we find a good number of inconsistencies in a whole raft of different ways. We have inconsistencies in the institutional form of regulators, the issue we were just talking about, from regulations which are done within departments through to those which are done at arm's length and various degrees of length of arm. We have different approaches to appeal rights through our statutes. We have quite different consultation obligations written into our statutes. A particular issue for New Zealand is the Treaty of Waitangi and how the principles of the treaty are expected to be incorporated into decision-making, and we have a variety of different sets of wording and approaches to that in our statutes. We also have widely varying funding mechanisms in our statutes. So it's complex, and we know that complex regulation is often poor regulation, and we know that poor regulation undermines perceptions of fairness, of social cohesion, and that sense of political legitimacy. So there are some key themes which I'm going to talk about which came through in our work. The first is around quality control, and our terms of reference steered us more towards the implementation and the operational end of the regulatory regimes. So starting after the Parliament had made its decision and passed the regulation. But as the inquiry progressed, we found ourselves increasingly drawn back into the front end of the process around the creation of the regulation and identifying a number of mechanisms which are intended to ensure that regulation is properly conceived and finding that those are under stress. One of them is the regulatory impact analysis process, which after 15 years of experience still isn't robust. Analysis of the merits of a regulatory intervention versus alternative policy responses are too often weak, as are the assessments of the efficacy and the costs associated with regulation. So, we understand that these processes face challenges everywhere, but our sense is that some of the Australian jurisdictions, perhaps Victoria in particular, has had more success than we have in terms of injecting rigour, transparency and accountability into the development of regulatory policy. We have within our Parliament a Regulations Review Committee. It's traditionally chaired by a member of the opposition, traditionally operates in a non-partisan manner, and this is it has a scope to roll over any regulation, new or existing, and review it. It's got a perfectly acceptable and adequate set of guidelines and criteria for assessing the merits of new or existing regulation, but it's really struggling to find traction on those guidelines. It meets for only an hour a week while the House is in session. It's supported by a little over one professional policy advisor. Its numbers have slipped from 8 till 5 over the last few years, and it's losing its non-partisan tone. It's a pity because it's an important mechanism which could be in place there. There's also another body called, the Law Commission, which has within it a Legislative Advisory Committee. It's an independent body chaired by an eminent judge. It draws upon a very satisfactory list of principles and criteria to assess the qualities of new statutes. In 2013, the Commission judged that more than half of the bills it reviewed were showing significant deficiencies. The Law Commission's work in this area has been curtailed more recently due to resource challenges, and it's really hard to get regulators to do better regulation when the legislative frameworks are soft at the outset. It's a weakness that could be fixed. Parliament's busy, and it seems loath to delegate rule-making powers to regulatory bodies. Our statutes include more detail than is typically found in other jurisdictions. When we went out and talked to the chief executives of regulatory agencies, 2/3 of them said that the statutes and regulations they were charged with implementing are obsolete or not fit for purpose. Given the limited time available in the House, the essential work of repairs and maintenance of existing law tends to be low on the list of priorities, so regulators are forced to devise workarounds or otherwise compromise their regulatory approaches. An obvious solution to the issue of maintaining the currency of regulation is to focus the content of the statutes on the purposes of the law and the principles to be applied in implementation, and delegate the creation of the more detailed regulations to a lower body, typically a regulator, with appropriate transparency and checks, of course. When we asked members of the Regulatory Review Committee, Regulations Review Committee, why there wasn't more delegation, the MPs said, oh no, you've got to keep the detail up because that's how we get accountability and certainty for the citizens. There's a lack of trust there that they can do this effectively. So does limiting delegation of discretion or discretionary decision-making powers to regulators provide better outcomes or greater certainty? And I think probably not. We need to be smarter and more systematic in the way that we keep our regulations up to date and fit for purpose, and where we are right now isn't working terribly well. Evaluation and review is another area of concern. We regulate a lot, and the architecture of our regulations could be designed with greater care. We pay too little attention to the functioning of our regulations once it's been enacted. Across a number of our inquiries, we've found weak capability for and limited attention to evaluative activities. There's little to guide post-implementation review as to whether a particular regime is achieving its intended outcomes. We're soft in specifying up front what would constitute success. But the effort devoted to evaluation is limited, and the feedback loops from review to adjustment is either non-existent or underdeveloped. We have a set or forget or a spray and walk away, if you want to use that term, approach to our regulation. There have been a number of attempts in recent years to try and boost the stewardship obligations of departments with respect to the regulatory regimes that they administer or oversee. But those initiatives have struggled to gain traction in the face of other priorities and limited follow-up, perhaps from the central agencies. One symptom of that is that we pay little, or relatively little, attention to our large stock of existing regulatory regimes. There's a good deal more energy around the creation of new law and regulation than there is around the repairs, maintenance and repeal of what we already have. Regulatory failures is the other area that I was going to touch on here. As I noted before, they can be catastrophic and they undermine wider community confidence in our regulatory system. In the course of our inquiry, we looked closely at 18 high-profile examples of regulatory failure in the UK, the US, Australia and New Zealand. In collaboration with Professor Julia Black of the London School of Economics, we've been reviewing the reports from official inquiries into those failures, looking for common themes. The idea is that common themes and regulatory failures indicate scope to reduce risks of future regulatory failure, and that give us a pointer as to where to concentrate effort in regulatory design and evaluation. The common themes that have come through won't be too surprising, but they still offer important insights. The lack of clarity about the role of regulators and other parties, weak governance, culture and leadership in systems, complex or obsolete regulation, a lack of resources, a lack of oversight of the regulation, poor risk assessment and enforcement. Our report deals with each of those factors in terms of the design and operation of the regimes in the New Zealand context. There'll be further work on this we're doing with Julia Black, I think likely to be published and make some interesting journal articles down the track. A key issue for us, and I think for this organisation, is around skills, training and professionalism, and we put a lot of effort onto this. Implementing regulation is increasingly challenging, and the academic thinking around good regulation practicing is evolving. For 20 years, the Ayres and Braithwaite responsible regulation has been the dominant influence in compliance and enforcement thinking here and in New Zealand and in the UK. The central idea is that compliance is more likely when the regulator operates an explicit enforcement pyramid based on the regulated party's willingness to comply. Risk-based regulation was the next major development, calling on regulators to focus on actions or areas that pose the greatest risk to the public or to the regulatory objectives. More recently, Julia Black and Robert Baldwin have been arguing that while responsive regulation or risk-based regulation describe the approach that regulators should or often do take, they don't have a great deal to say about how a regulator should deal with resource constraints, conflicting institutional pressures, unclear objectives or changes in the regulatory environment. Black and Baldwin are advocating what they call really responsive approach, involving the analysis of the motivations, the interactions, the institutional environment of the regulatory actors in those regimes. Being really responsive requires regulators to become more attentive to the environment in which they're operating, the factors that might shape the response of regulated parties to the regulatory regime, and the need to be able to adapt to changing circumstances. As the regulatory task becomes more sophisticated, regulators must become more skilled and more sophisticated also. When we asked the CEOs of New Zealand regulatory agencies about the capability of their regulatory workforce, about 20% thought they faced significant skill gaps amongst their staff. When we asked the personnel themselves, the regulatory personnel, and the businesses regularly engaging with regulators, the perception of skill inadequacies and gaps in training was far more widespread. We found that while there's a good range of training opportunities around the New Zealand system, too many are not well aligned to the current needs of the system, and too few regulators are being exposed to them. Indeed, completion rates of courses within the programs currently on offer are particularly low. To give you a sense of the gap, with over 10,000 people employed in regulatory roles in New Zealand, there are only 65 who completed the National Compliance Qualifications, a program expressly designed for regulatory staff, between August 2012 and January of this year. There's a place for ANZSOG in here, I think, Gary. Our analysis pointed to the need to lift the professionalism of the regulatory workforce through lifting professional leadership, building stronger communities of practice at different levels of the regulatory value chain, and strengthening managerial focus on workforce capability within regulatory agencies. Monitoring is another factor, particularly with our arm's length agencies. A lot of our regulatory activity is carried out through Crown agencies, more or less independently at arm's length from ministers. Each of these Crown agencies is allocated to a core government department and subject to monitoring by that department. Crown agencies also typically have an external board for governance purposes, and many have statutory independence from ministerial involvement in their regulatory functions. We found a good deal of dissatisfaction on the part of the regulator board members with respect to this monitoring function. Few felt that the monitoring effort of the lead department was adding much value either to the minister, who's the intended beneficiary of the monitor's work, or to the Crown agency itself. This dissatisfaction is compounded by a good deal of role confusion with respect to ministers, monitors, board chairs and chief executives. Too often boards and their chairs feel that they are disempowered by the monitoring, and ministers reach over the boards to work directly with the chief executive of the agency concerned, or even directly with lower level executives. We have a few recommendations on that as well. Let's look at the level of the system of our regulatory processes. When we look across the public policy machinery, we find a number of very well-run systems with clear, coherent and functional governance supported by strong policy brains. As examples, our tax system was well-run and clearly owned by the Department of Inland Revenue. The Treasury clearly owns and is responsible for the fiscal system. It can monitor it, it can forecast it and track what's going on. Monetary policy is equally clearly the responsibility of the Reserve Bank. In each case, the agencies concerned are clear about their roles, are equipped to do the job. They're capable of thinking strategically about what they do, why they do it, how they judge success or failure, and what they need to do to prepare for a different future. By contrast, our regulatory system has no clear ownership. Individual regulatory regimes have owners, and much of the regulatory stewardship function referred to earlier exists in the silo of the relevant department, so we're running vertical silos rather than across. No one has a clear responsibility for the regulatory system as a whole. With clear ownership would come a stronger focus on the regulatory system, its performance, and a sense of the applicable performance objectives, a more strategic approach to prioritisation of effort across the system, clearer specification and allocation of tasks to improve the system, promotion of continuous improvement in regulatory design and practice. This needs properly designed and resourced political, institutional, managerial and intellectual support, and our recommendations aim to deal with a number of those matters. In total, we made 44 recommendations across this report, and I'm just going to tick through a few themes here. The first one is around ownership and leadership from the centre. We're proposing that a senior minister in Cabinet needs to be given responsibility for the regulatory system. It's a role that in part exists with Bill English right now, but needs to be strengthened. That job would involve identifying areas of risk in the system, setting priorities or objectives to raise its performance, allocating tasks to achieve those objectives. To carry out the role, the minister would need more active support from central agencies, and we recommended an expanded and more prominent role for the Treasury in regulatory policy and management. The second theme is around the quality of legislation. if New Zealand is continuing to base its regulatory regimes heavily on primary legislation, it's important we get the design right. We've recommended a review of quality checks and processes around the preparation of laws, including the regulatory impact assessment process, and external review by bodies such as the Law Commission. We believe there is more use to be made of exposure drafts of bills, as often occurs in Australia, which would help identify and iron out some problems in draft legislation. Third area is professionalisation, which I talked about earlier. There are some useful initiatives in building capability by senior regulatory leaders, and that's happened particularly in areas of compliance and enforcement, and it's been a useful process and it's now being supported from the centre. We think there's more of that to be done, particularly back up the chain a little bit in the regulatory policy area. We're also suggesting that the government clarify and strengthen its expectations on regulators to develop their staff and work with other regulatory agencies in building capability. The Commission also believed that there was room to appoint what we've labelled a head of profession. So it's about providing intellectual leadership and promoting good practice for the regulatory workforce. This is about promoting thinking, linking with international developments, being across leading academic thinking and translating that back into a New Zealand context. The final theme is around review and evaluation. We need more of it. We need to put more effort into targeting the most important regimes for review. We recommended a process of peer review for regulatory agencies in which senior leaders from other agencies would assess each other's performance and evaluation, a development of the performance improvement framework already in place for government agencies. Concluding comments are that if the theme of this is better regulation, are we achieving it? Our inquiry looked across the New Zealand regulatory machinery and concluded, well, could do better. There are many things we could do better, and the rewards for doing so are likely to be substantial and widespread. We've got a pretty good sense, I think, of the characteristics of good regulation and good regulators. The front end of the regulatory process is critical. That includes strong links between problem identification, policy analysis, including options for how best to respond to the identified problem, and translation from that through to the design of regulatory regimes where that's judged to be the best option. Institutional design matters, but equally important is what goes on within and between regulatory institutions, their capability, governance, leadership, professionalism, culture and training. As we ask more of our regulators, we should not be surprised that the softer skills are also becoming more important. Thank you.